Okay, let's get started. Maybe I should introduce my colleagues and myself. I'm Jeffrey Brown. I'm a program officer in the TIP Directorate in the working on the engines program. My colleague, Frances Mary Madugno. Would you like to introduce yourself, Frances Mary?
Yes, hi, thanks, Jeffrey. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm Frances Mary Madugno. I'm a program officer here in the Division of Graduate Education, within the Education Directorate.
TJ. So TJ, before he introduces himself, I just want to say TJ is the one who created all the Airtable data for you. So you owe him a great debt because he made a lot of data available that I hope will help with the teaming activities. TJ.
Hi, I'm TJ. I'm a summer intern here at NSF in the TIP Directorate as part of the UVA Policy Internship Program.
Thank you so much. So as I was saying before we got delayed a bit, this session is about the budget issues for Engines program, and it'll be two parts. We'll do some presentation and then we'll have some time for Q&A. And so TJ and Frances Mary will be teeing up the questions for me at the end. I will say that I will not be dealing with things that delve into policy issues in terms of answering questions. So if you have a very detailed question about what goes where, the best way to handle that is by sending a note to engines@nsf.gov, and that email address will have at the end of the presentation as well. I viewed this as there being two categories of audience here. There are those from institutions of higher education who have a lot of experience with NSF budgets, although for the Engines program, there are some significant differences in the kinds of ways in which we're dealing with budgets, and in particular, we're allowing things that are often not allowed in normal programs in order to provide flexibility for building out engines. And then for those of you who are not from institutions of higher education, many of you probably have less experience with NSF budgets. And I will say that the standard form for budgets is really aimed at a higher education model. So we're going to take advantage of placeholders in the budget to enable other kinds of activities that fall outside the kinds of things that are only done in higher education. So a couple of major points to start with. First of all awards with the Engines program, Type 1 and Type 2, will be structured as cooperative agreements. A cooperative agreement is there's a period of negotiation after a decision is made to make an award before the award is made. And that negotiation period will involve the awardee and NSF, and many things having to do with the budgets will be settled there. Now, we're expecting the budgets to be relatively complete at the point of the proposal stage, but there'll be some negotiation. In particular, some of the things that fall outside the norm for NSF, particularly for Type 2 awards that might, say, involve seed funding and things like that, will be subject to some kind of negotiation process. The other thing that's a little unusual about this program is that the budgets are for a 2-year window. Now, for the Type 1 awards, it's only a 2-year window. But for Type 2 awards, there'll be a sliding 2-year window. That means every year, there will be a negotiation of the budget for the next 2-year period. So that so every year you'll be relooking at the budget for the next year and for the following year. Another important point is that the award will be made to the lead organization, but the lead organization will make subawards to their partners. And subawards carry with them additional budget information about what the partners, what funding goes to the partner and what the partners are spending those monies for. There are a number of exceptions to sort of standard rules for institutions of higher education. You're probably familiar with the normal NSF award, which limits senior personnel to 2 months of salary. That isn't a constraint for the Engines program, although any kind of award for extended periods of salary would have to be justified in the budget justification. In addition, although this is not part of the budget, but it is part of the proposal process, there's an expectation of declaring existing and new resources. And that's laid out in the BAA in quite a bit of detail. It's particularly important for Type 2 awards. For Type 1 awards, there isn't so much of an expectation, although there is a place for you to do that in your proposal. There are some limits on building and upgrading infrastructure. You can look at the BAA for the specific limit, but you cannot spend all of the Engines award on building infrastructure, for example. Another difference from many but not all programs is that for-profits can receive NSF funds. They can be lead organizations, they can be sub-awardees. Any really special cases should be discussed with the NSF program officers. Now, what I want to do first is go through a few of the things we put in the FAQs, just to sort of seed the conversation. And then I'll come back and look at the ways in which the system in which the proposals will be submitted, the BAAM system, handles budgets. It's different from research.gov. It's different from fastlane.gov. So it's important to see how this works. And in particular, there's some issues around subawards that it's helpful to have seen what the screenshots look like so you understand how to handle subawards. So for the budget FAQs, in the FAQs that are published on the, along with the BAA, there are a number of questions about budgets. So an important question for Type 1 budgets is, what should they fund? Well, the way to answer that question is to think about what the purpose of a Type 1 award is. The purpose of a Type 1 award is to lay the groundwork for a competitive Type 2 proposal. That's it. Our goal in having the Type 1 awards was to allow regions that were not ready to pursue a Type 2 award to have a chance to build up the team, the partnerships necessary to put together a competitive Type 2 award proposal. Now, obviously, what that means is most of the money is going to be spent on forming a leadership team, building the partnerships, preparing a strategic plan, having activities and events aimed at that. It should not be used for carrying out technical research activities. This is not like a preliminary award for a scientific, for a purely scientific program. So you should not expect that your Type 1 budget will cover preliminary research. It could, for example, cover preliminary work on workforce development. So, for example, as part of a Type 2 award, there has to be a workforce development plan, and it might be important to put together some preliminary work on what those workforce plans would look like, and even some pilot some simple, some basic workforce development activities. But research is one thing that we've listed that should not be considered as part of a Type 1 budget. Does NSF Engine's team expect NSF funds to cover the full cost of an engine? Now, for Type 1 awards, it will cover most of those activities. But for a Type 2 award, remember that we talked about earlier in the session the sustainability issues with respect to building an engine. Our expectation is that at the end of 10 years, that this will be a self-sustaining entity. So in that period of 10 years, there should be additional funds coming in. And our expectation, NSF's team, Engines team, is that there will be significant outside capital from state, federal, philanthropic, corporate sources to achieve the full ambition of an engine. It is not our expectation, for example, that $160 million is enough by itself to achieve our goal of having a self-sustaining regional innovation engine at the end of 10 years. It's enough to seed all those activities. It's enough to build those partnerships, to do some of the work, but it's not enough to build the whole engine by itself. So you should be thinking in Type 2 awards about where those funds are going to be coming from, what kinds of starting funds there are, starting resources there are, and how this might play into the long-term sustainability of the engine. How flexible is NSF with respect to budgets? Well, the answer is we expect to be very flexible within the limits of what the government allows. There are clearly some limits. I list here just one, that academic year salaries for faculty and providing is an area that is usually not allowed in NSF budget. Another area which you might consider is, for example, in terms of workforce development, is you might need participant subsidies to improve the completion rate for workforce development programs. When we looked at workforce development programs that were successful around the country, many of them provided some amount of participant subsidy to make that work. Now that's up to you to decide what that would be. Anything that's really outside the norm, you should have a discussion with us. Now I will say that the exact budget amounts probably aren't going to help or hurt you in the evaluation process and are subject to negotiation in the cooperative agreement. But you should have a pretty good argument for why you want to spend money in certain ways outside of the sort of normal kinds of things. What kind of industrial and state leverage is expected. Well, there's no expectation of a particular level. Why is that? Well, some regions will have access to a lot of leverage, and some are starting from a very different place. And remember that the goal of this program is to extend the benefits of economic development through innovation across the country. So what you should be doing is building a case for why the leverage that you can achieve is appropriate or given the limitations or the strengths of your region. For type 2 proposals, we expect a lot more in this regard than for type 1 proposals. Now, this is specific to a type 2. Can an NSF engine use NSF funds as seed funds for startups? The basic answer is yes, but not in a totally unconstrained way. You're going to have to build the case for why you want to do that, what amounts are appropriate, how you're going to manage those funds. There has to be a plan for due diligence and for addressing conflicts of interest. So you should discuss any such plans with NSF. Now, not all of this has to fit into your page limit for the proposal, but it should be something that you address in your budget justification, and it should be something you're prepared to defend in the process of the cooperative agreement negotiations. Can an NSF engine take an equity stake in a startup? The basic answer is yes. You're going to have to defend this as part of the business model for sustaining the NSF engine, but yes, you can potentially take an equity stake in a startup. Your engine can, I should say. So now I want to talk a little bit about NSF budgets. And all of this, everything that goes into a budget for an NSF proposal is described in the Proposal Award Policies and Procedures Guide. It's often called the PAPPG, P-A-P-P-G. You can look this up online. There's a section about budgets. And the things that the PAPPG addresses are the sections of the budget, and there are mandatory sections to the budget, and budget justifications. Budget justifications are where you explain why you're doing certain things within the budget, whereas the budget itself is just really just the numbers. Things that go into a budget, and these are the major sections that are defined in the PAPPG, are salaries and wages, equipment, travel, participant support, and participant support is things like supporting interns or providing funds to help with workforce development participants. Other direct costs, and then indirect costs. Indirect costs have to be based upon a U.S. federally negotiated rate. Other direct costs turns out to be really important for the engines program because there are a lot of things that fall outside of the norm in terms of the normal NSF budget. So the things that ordinarily go into the other direct costs are things like materials and supplies, publication, documentation, dissemination. This turns out to be a category that's most important to academic researchers because publications these days cost money, so they want to budget for the cost of publication or documentation. But it's a budget category within the other category. Consultant services. This may be something that's important for engines. You may need to hire consultants to help you with developing plans. And so we can talk about that a little bit more, but again, if you're going to hire consultants or consulting group, then you need to discuss that and justify that in your budget. Computer services, again, this is something that usually applies, is important for academic researchers and may or may not be important for an engine budget. And then subawards. Now this turns out to be extraordinarily important because of the way that engines budgets are going to be structured with a lead organization making subawards to various partners. And then finally, there's this catch-all, other. So we've got other and then other within other. But there will be things, for example, going back to the question of seed funding for startups, that probably, although I don't want to commit to that, would go into this other category and then be justified in your budget justification. So consultant services, let's talk about that a little bit more. The proposal budget can request funds for professional and consultant services. These are services provided by people who are members of a particular profession or possess a special skill, but who are not part of the proposing organization or the partners themselves. And Again, these have to be justified. The amounts that you would spend would need to be justified, but this is totally allowable in an NSF engine proposal. Subawards are where the partners get their money. And what I want to point out here is in yellow, which is particularly important, is that the line in the budget for subawards is automatically generated. Until you have subawardees, there will be no line for subawards. So the data for the subaward line, and there'll be one for each subawardee, will be generated automatically from the subaward budgets that you upload into the BAAM system. So here's what budget entry looks like in BAAM. This is a screenshot from the BAAM system. I made a phony baloney proposal in order to get to this stage. What you can see here is the first part of it. There'll be multiple screens here. There are two lines here for personnel. There's senior personnel. These would be your CEO or senior staff positions that would make up the, in this case, the budget for the lead organization, but the subaward budgets would have similar lines in them for personnel. And then there are other kinds of personnel. Postdoctoral scholars, this applies mostly to academic organizations, graduate students and undergraduate students. These typically apply to institutions of higher education. But then there's administrative and clerical and other professionals. And then there's finally yet another catch-all, other. Anything you put into this has to be justified in the budget justification. So if you're going to have senior personnel, you need to list those senior personnel, explain what their positions are, and then explain where the money goes. And then a separate line in this is fringe benefits. You know, the salaries are separated out in NSF budgets from the fringe benefits. Oops. So I want to just skip ahead and talk about, for a moment, about budget entry. So in order to get to the form I just showed you, you have to enter either the prime award organization, that's me, so where it says prime award there, if you clicked on that, you'd get to that budget form I just showed you. But if they're going to be subawardees, you'll have to add the subaward organizations to each one of them as a separate line item here. And when you add the subaward organization, there'll be a similar link that you can click to put in the budget for the subawardee. And then there's another line here we'll talk about in a moment called budget justification. So here's an example of listing a bunch of subawardees. You can see, this is not my example, this is from another test proposal, but the prime organization is this organization, WMG Incorporated, with a principal investigator, Brian Kirby. And then if you would click on the WMG Incorporated, you would get to the page where you enter the budget for the prime organization. Notice also that there are these two subawardees. And again, each of them has a hyperlink, ABC Corporation and Medilance LLC, that would take you to the budget for the subawardee. Now, continuing with the budget form, after participant call, after personnel, then we have these other direct costs. You have equipment, travel, and there are two types of travel that have to be called out separately, although you would really have to justify foreign travel pretty carefully in an engines award, since it doesn't necessarily involve foreign partners. In fact, foreign partners require some additional justification. Participant support costs, I mentioned that these are things like support for interns or for workforce development participants. And then the other direct costs, this is only part of the line here, it gets clipped, and I'll show you the next line. These are materials and supplies, publication, documentation, consultant services, and computer services. So you can see that what actually goes in the budget are really just the data of the budget, not the description of the budget at all. And then finally, the rest of the direct costs, and some of this is repeated from the previous slide, you see that there's a place that seems to be missing here, the subaward line. There's everything else was what I listed at the beginning when I talked about the PAPPG, but now we have a subaward line that needs to be added in here. And it gets added as you add a subawardee to the budget. And then the final thing here is indirect costs. Indirect costs are often called overhead. They are the negotiated rate where the direct costs, where the indirect costs are a fraction of the direct costs. And this has to be a negotiated rate with the government. So now here's what it looks like when you've added sub-awardees to this. So this is an example where there's some data filled in. And notice that each of the sub-awardees I showed you before, now has its own line item. And the data from here, the number for sub-award ABC Corporation of $195,750 is generated automatically or extracted automatically from the actual budget request for that sub-awardee. Oops. So for budget justification, the BAA tells you exactly how many pages you're allowed to use for the budget justification. And each of those will be a file, a PDF file, preferably. You'll have to have a budget justification for the prime and for each of the sub-awardees, a separate budget justification for each of those. And as I mentioned, the budget justification explains where the numbers come from that are part of the budget. So for example, if they're 4 senior personnel, the budget justification would explain what their salary is and what their function is, what their role is in the project. So here are a few more budget scenarios. Can NSF funds be used to provide competitive grants? Well, these are some examples. Again, these would have to be negotiated with NSF. You would have to discuss them and justify them. But these are possible things you could consider. Innovation vouchers to startups. Support for entrepreneurs and residence programs. These are just a couple of examples. We're looking for you to be relatively creative in how you build your engine, but you have to be able to explain why you're doing certain things. Here's some more budget scenarios. Can an engine provide funds to existing organizations to enhance or strengthen programs? The answer is yes. Your partners might need additional funds in order to provide the additional resources or the additional activities needed to support the engine. So for example, you might look at the accelerators, innovation accelerators, or groups that work with startups and fund them particularly to help with creating startups to support the activities of the engine, to be examples. But the important thing is you have to be able to justify that these programs, whatever they are relevant to the engine. You need to be able to show that by building strategic partnerships that benefit key stakeholders. So you need to be able to say why you're doing these things and how it plays into the overall plans of your engine. You might provide funds to workforce development organizations. You might fund existing incubators, provide pilot awards. You might support internship opportunities at startups. There are lots of things you could potentially do. So it's worth thinking carefully about, and this is particularly true for Type 2 awards, about how you're going to build out all the various pieces necessary to support a thriving innovation ecosystem. So here are some key points, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. The budget justification document is important, especially for things that are outside the norm being things that would ordinarily fall into an NSF budget. For example, personnel would be the norm, computer services is the norm, but the things that you would put into the other section would fall outside the norm. All budgets are subject to negotiation during the cooperative agreement process. And if there are errors or there are things that need further clarification, it would happen at that point. So your goal is to have a budget that explains what you're going to do and how you're going to spend NSF funds. And remember, this is a 2-year budget. So if you look at the BAA for Type 2 awards, you can see the amount of funding available in the first 2 years, and your budget should reflect that 2-year window of funding. And you should explain why you're doing various things. If you need guidance, if you're doing something outside the norm, or you need some help in understanding things, you need to contact the Engines team at nsf.gov. Okay, so I'm going to move on to, let me stop sharing the screen here, and then we're going to move on to answering questions. I see there are a lot of them teed up, and Francis Mary is going to sort of cue me on the appropriate question to answer.
We would like a clarification of what is meant by declaration of existing and new resources.
Sure. So the BAA actually defines what needs to go into that. So there's a section in the description of what makes up a proposal, and you need to, in that section, declare what it's a separate section. What new resources you're bringing from outside. These are resources from not from NSF funds, but from various partners or from state, local government organizations. And also what existing resources are going to be used in the pursuit of building this engine. So there may be existing facilities that are going to be used and they can be dedicated to the goals of the engine. For example, a university might supply space, or a for-profit might supply space. So that would be an existing resource. And then new resources would be things that you would gather in the way of contributions potentially, or would generate new resources.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. So for type 1 proposals, we have several questions. Can you please clarify what is meant by use-inspired research and development for a type 1 proposal if the expectation is that no technical research will be done?
Well, so you should be explaining where you're headed with this. So beyond just explaining what the topic area is, what are the research questions that would be addressed? What are the kinds of things that this engine would do? Remember, we want to understand where you're headed with a type 1. We're looking for something that's building to a competitive type 2 proposal. So even though you will not actually be performing significant research or using funds for preliminary research, you should understand what that research agenda might look like.
Okay, another question about type 1 proposals. Do type 1 proposals have to budget for a 2-year full-time CEO if one is identified?
No, you do not. For type 1 proposal, you do not have to have a full-time CEO. It would be, although in some cases it might be the appropriate thing to do, it's not a requirement.
Okay. And then also about type 1s, will the $1 million for type 1 awards be provided in advance, or is as a grant in advance, or a cooperative agreement in advance, or will the recipients have to remit and receive reimbursement as they encounter costs?
No, it'll be an award, whether it's given out in one lump sum or whether it is doled out in tranches is subject to negotiation, but it will not be. You will not be billing NSF for expenses.
Okay. Can type 1 grants support the trial deployment of the envisioned technology?
You're suggesting can it do some seed deployment of it? Potentially. I think you need, no rule is hard and fast in this regard, but I think you should discuss that with NSF team if you have particular plans in mind. But remember, the primary goal of this type 1 award is to build the foundation, the teamwork, the set of partners, the team that's going to apply for the type 2 award. If you want to do some initial deployment, possibly, but it should not be a primary function of the award.
Okay, and can type 1 award monies be used to build infrastructure, which would be important for conducting the activities under the award?
Well, you'd have to justify why they're important for the type 2 award, for the activities on the type 1 award, why they're important for those activities. I don't want to say never, but you do have to provide a justification for how that is necessary for doing the work of the type 1 award, as opposed to preparing for the type 2 award.
Okay. And we did get a question about completing a type 1 award in 1 year versus 2.
I'm not sure why you would want to do that. We haven't yet announced the next competition or for type 2 awards, but our plans involve making it so that the type 1 awardees would be well positioned to submit proposals for the next round of type 2 awards.
Okay. I'm going to go to the type 2 questions now. Are the type 2 proposal budgets, do they need to budget for the whole 10 years or just 1 or 2 years?
Your budget should be for a 2-year budget. You should lay out a plan for the entire 10-year, what your trajectory would look like, but that's not part of the budget. That's more the kinds of activities that the engine will be involved with and the timeline over which you'll be doing those things. So for example, in workforce development, what do you expect in the first couple of years versus what are your plans 5 years out or 10 years out for workforce development? In terms of the budget, it's a 2-year budget. So you're budgeting only the activities that would take place in the first 2 years. If you were awarded a Type 2 award at the end of year 1, you would be negotiating for the next 2 years, sliding 2 years, right? So the second year of the award would be reconsidered, the budget for it at that point, putting together the second 2-year budget. That's why I say it's a sliding window as opposed to 2 years, and then after 2 years, you do another 2-year budget.
Okay. Can Type 2 awards budget for a full-time dedicated administrative assistant?
Sure. I mean, it's likely that somebody like that would be necessary. So again, the budget justification has to explain why you're doing it. But you know, the leadership team is going to have a lot of work to do, and they clearly are going to need help.
Back to Type 1, can Type 1s budget for student and postdoctoral scholars?
You would have to really justify why that's important to the Type 1 activities, and not just funding their research.
Can you talk a bit about leveraging existing resources and how to leverage existing resources while steering clear of the federal cost sharing prohibition?
Well, the only thing about the cost sharing prohibition is it's not part of your budget. That's it. You can't list those resources as you're leveraging as part of your budget. But there's an expectation that there's a commitment. So when in the BAA, it describes the kind of things you have to provide, the kind of information about additional resources you're going to bring in, and you need to talk about how you're going to use them, but they aren't part of the budget that you submit. It's a very technical detail, but that's the difference between cost sharing and leverage.
Will scholarships to students be covered, and what about after-school STEM programs?
Well, again, you have to justify that in terms of the activities of your engine. So that's part of workforce development, and there's a well-established plan for how you might do STEM education and lead to the development of a workforce. The answer is yes. With all of these things, it comes down to building it into your plan and making it clear why you're doing certain things.
Okay. With respect to subawards, what information would need to be included if you have a TBD subaward? Do you still need a separate justification outlining the potential partner's role, but without line items?
I don't know how you do a subaward budget without knowing what the numbers are. So it would suggest that maybe the partnership isn't yet established. I don't know. But the expectation is you're listing the partners that you want to fund.
Okay. In a Type 1 award, developing those partnerships, then they aren't known ahead of time. If during the course of the 2 years you want to fund a partner, how would they go about doing that?
Well, you'd renegotiate the budget with NSF. By the way, this is a normal thing that happens in NSF awards, not just the engines program. That if there's a change of direction or change of activities, then you can renegotiate the budget with the program officers. So this is not outside the norm.
Okay. We have a question about the confidentiality of subawards. I believe all the financial information is confidential, but just wanting to confirm that.
Confidential from whom? From reviewers or from outside NSF? So everything in a proposal and budget is confidential within the merit review process, but I'm not quite clear on what level of confidentiality they're asking about.
Okay, I think we answered that. For Type 1, can you cover third-party research services that support technology feasibility?
Yes, if you can justify it.
Okay. For type 2, can funds be used to build infrastructure, shared facilities for innovation, incubators, for example, laboratories, greenhouses, or manufacturing? That could be used for academic startup and workforce training.
Yes, although the BAA limits the amount that can be spent on facilities.
Okay. And for type 2, where would you speak about leveraging resources in the proposal? Would you do it in the facilities and other resources document or in the main proposal?
I wish I had the BAA in front of me, but that's all laid out exactly where it goes and how many pages you have to discuss leveraging external resources.
Okay. We had a question about the 2-month limitation, but I believe you addressed that this, especially for the CEO, which is full-time, does not fall under the 2-month limitation.
That's correct. The 2-month limitation is normal for standard research awards, but if you can justify the number of months or the year-long salary and why that position is important, then that limitation doesn't apply to the engines program.
Okay, so we got a question about subawards, which I answered during your talk, which is if you have a not-for-profit entity that is receiving a subaward and that entity does not have a negotiated indirect rate with NSF, per the PAPPG, they use the 10% de minimis. However, if you are not for profit, this is the question for you, Jeffrey, without a federally negotiated indirect rate and are planning to serve as the lead applicant, can they use that 10% indirect rate?
I believe so, although you might be better placed to try and negotiate a rate.
Yeah. For subawardees, do the contracts have to pass through all the requirements in the awardee contract? For example, things like Title IX.
The lead organization is responsible for the contract. So they're responsible for ensuring that their subawardees obey federal law. But no, we won't be looking deeply into the subawardees, I don't believe.
Okay. Can funds be used to provide free services that encourage participation in the engine?
I'm not sure I understand what the question is.
Yeah. And we have another question about involving expertise and asking if they can involve professional school faculty such as business and law in addition to science and engineering. And I'm going to answer that and say yes. As best fits your proposal, you should involve the appropriate parties. Okay. Do you have to have subawards for type 1? No.
No, you do not. Although, you know, some set of partners is certainly appropriate in type 1. We will be looking at whether you establish at least some initial partners.
This question is for about type 2. Since there are only 5 type 2 engines being awarded, will there be reserving some of these awards for the next cycle as type 1s advance to become type 2 proposals?
We're anticipating funding additional awards once the first round is completed. I'm not quite sure that was the question, but that's as I interpret it.
That's how I interpret it as well. So can a type 2 engine make a grant to universities for industry-university collaborative commercialization projects? Would those projects need to be fully defined by the budget request, or could funds be set aside for a competitive process? For example, 5 projects at $50,000 each would be a $250,000 line item dedicated to commercialization projects between academia and industry.
Well, the answer is yes, you could do that. Again, you need to justify it and how it fits into the overall plans. And I can tell you also, if the award were made, that would be discussed in the cooperative agreement stage to make sure that NSF understood exactly what the process was and what the purpose of those awards would be.
Okay. Can undergraduate student fees and stipends for their time related to the engines project be covered by an engine?
Potentially. Again, subject to justification. You'd have to explain what the role of those students were and why you were supporting them with tuition and fees.
Okay. Can type 2 budget subsidies, for example, an engine may want to encourage internships in companies by funding 50% of the internship with the company funding the other 50%. Would the other 50% be considered new resources being brought from an external industry resource? And would there be any issue with that being considered a form of cost sharing?
Well, again, cost sharing is a very technical thing, which is that you build it into the budget. So what you would be doing is in your budget, listing the amount you want to use for subsidies for internships, but you would not be putting into the budget the amount that the corporation would be putting up. So the answer is yes, you can do that, and you would not list the contribution of the corporation in your budget.
Okay. Do type 1 proposals allow international consulting services?
Potentially, but you know, that's the kind of thing you really do want to discuss with program officers. You have to be sensitive to the idea that the NSF is responsible to U.S. taxpayers, and we would want to know why funds were being spent outside of the U.S.
So type 1 proposals, are there mandatory meetings and NSF required events that need to be built into the budget?
Yes, I believe the BAA talks to the PI meetings that are required as part of the budget that's required for type 1 and type 2.
What's the difference between the letter of collaboration and the letter of support by partners and industry members?
Francis Mary, would you like to try this one? I'm not sure I can.
I think you need to carefully read the BAA and then go to the PAPPG. I know for letters of support for our program, not this engines program, the letter of support just has to state that the entity is providing the services as outlined in the proposal. Whereas if we ask for a letter of collaboration, it provides more detail to the degree of what that collaboration is. So I don't have the BAA in front of me, but I think it would be addressed in the BAA. And if it's not, then it defaults to the definitions in the PAPPG.
Thank you.
Do type 2 proposals need to budget for the full-time CEO for the full 2 years, or would 1 year be sufficient?
So, did you say type 2? Type 2 awards have to have a full-time CEO for the entire life of the award. So it would be a 2-year budget.
For type 2 proposals, does the executive position holders' names do they have to be named at the time that the proposal is submitted?
No, the BAA gives, I believe, 3 or 6 months to find the CEO.
For the 2-year type 2 budget, are the funds given up front, or are they awarded on a yearly basis based on the progress report?
Well, again, that would come out in the cooperative agreement negotiations. A typical thing would be to award, well, these are large awards for type 2, so it might very well be that they would be done in 2 tranches each year.
Okay, we've got a few questions about getting a negotiated rate. I think that's outside of at least my expertise.
That's well outside my
Yes.
expertise.
You need to contact NSF and talk to them directly about that, not the appropriate offices at NSF. So does the type 1 award preclude application of other funding sources, for example, the DOE, the DOT, and even NSF, to pursue related technical research that might support the engine?
No. If you can bring in external money, terrific.
Can you clarify the roles of other senior personnel, subawardee personnel, other personnel, and collaborator personnel?
I really don't understand the question. So senior personnel are typically named individuals. When you list the senior personnel in the budget, you're naming particular individuals to fill that role mostly. I mean, in the case of the CEO for Type 2, you might have a placeholder. Other personnel might be listed, for example, we need 3 technicians at $75,000 a year or something like that, so they're not named. In terms of the budgets for the subawardees, you have the same thing. You'd have senior personnel for the subawardee, they're probably named people, and then you might have other personnel who are not specifically named, but there's a budget for their salary and fringe.
Okay. Can a Type 1 lead organization be on a Type 2 subaward?
You would really have to justify to NSF how you had time to do both those things. So the answer is you're not, organizations can only be lead on one award, but they can be partners in others. But if you're the lead on one award, we would want to know that you had the resources to actually perform the work in both cases.
Are there limitations on how much funds can go to consultants and or subawardees?
There are no limitations. It's all subject to justification.
Can funds be used for training or educational resources to support talent development at organizations and startups linked to the regional engine, such as work-based learning at firms?
Sure, if it's part of your workforce development plan, then again, you explain what that organization's role was and why you were spending the money in that way.
Okay. Can Type 2 proposals include funding to run a small regional grant program? Yes.
Well, actually, I addressed this a little bit in the presentation, but the answer is yes. But you'd want to explain how that program is going to be managed, what the goals of the program were, how awards were going to be made, those kinds of things.
Okay. How does NSF define a national laboratory for the eligibility requirement?
This is a very technical question, so I think you should send it to the engines at nsf.gov. And the reason I say that is there's a specific category called national laboratories, and then there are other institutions that are they are part of the federal government, but they're not considered national laboratories. So you should send that question.
Okay, and since this is issued under a BAA, what PAPPG requirements will or will not be applicable to the submission of these proposals?
Well, by default, all the PAPPG requirements are applicable, but the BAA for the program lists some specific additional things and exceptions potentially to the PAPPG, but by default, the PAPPG always applies.
Okay, just for the letters of intent, do you have to list all the subawardees or can they be added later in the proposal?
They can be added later.
And can subawardees be added during the cooperative agreement period if they were not listed in the original budget or proposal?
Certainly, you can renegotiate the budget or discuss the changes to the budget to add subawardees.
Are core participants, or I'm sorry, are core partners considered to be subawardees?
The only way that they can be funded is through a subaward, but you might have core partners who receive no direct funding.
A lot of questions about getting the negotiated rate. Would NSF consider competitive seed grant funds to startups to be participant support costs? Do seed funds to startup companies or the new university industry partnerships require subawards? So are seed grants considered participant support?
No, they're not. You'd list them under other, and you'd provide an explanation of why you're doing it, but they're not considered participant support. That's a particular category that really is about funding or paying individuals either for their time or for their travel or for their housing. And it doesn't really apply to seed funding for a startup.
Are there federal procurement guideline issues for hiring consultants for a type 1? For example, do you have to deploy a formal RFP?
No, you don't have to do a formal RFP.
If key personnel is spread across subawardees, do they go in the key personnel and the subaward budget? Yes.
If they work for the subawardee and they're being paid out of the subaward, they go into the subaward budget. If they're being paid by the lead organization, they go in the lead organization's budget.
Okay. Will institutional officials have access to the proposal system, for example, for helping in submitting budgets?
Unfortunately, no. Only the PI or the person submitting the award has direct access to it, although they could potentially share their login.gov, or I mean, it's up to the institution to figure out how they want to do that. The other way to do it is to have the institution actually have a login.gov account, and they're the ones to submit the proposal. But it does not work like Fastlane, where there's a separate access mechanism.
Okay. And I guess that answers this question about the proposal being created by the lead PI of the lead organization only, or can a research administrator create the proposal and add users as appropriate?
There's only one user. Let's just start with that. And so whoever that user is the one that is ultimately responsible for submitting the proposal.
Okay, we're back to some questions about type 1. You noted that research should not be conducted. However, we need to do a life cycle analysis for environmental impact, modeling for land use and outreach surveys to growers to present appropriate impact. In other contexts, these would be considered research activities. Are these considered research activities?
I think you'll have to ask that question and be more specific in engines at nsf.gov.
Yeah. And can funds be used to do a literature review?
Yes. I'm not sure what that would entail, but yes.
For type 2 proposals, when you identify existing resources that are being used or made available to the engine, do you need to specify the anticipated percentage of capacity that will be utilized if it's not dedicated to the engine?
Can you repeat that? I think we're also going to have to wrap it up. I think we're actually over time, but go ahead and repeat that question. I'll answer it.
I just, hold on, I blocked it out and scrolled past it. It had to do with if you are using a shared resource that's not totally dedicated. Oh, here it is. Okay. If you identify a resource that's being used by the engine, but not totally dedicated to the engine, do you need to specify the anticipated percentage of capacity that's being used by the engine?
You would like to explain how the funds are being used. If that means specifying the capacity, then that's what you would have to do. I think thank you very much. I think we have to stop here because we were really supposed to stop at 4:30. Please send all your questions to engines@nsf.gov if they weren't answered.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Francis Mary. Thank you, TJ.